While we'll be covering many technologies in Encore together that are quite sophisticated and might be new to you, we begin with a classic. As we talk about network design in this section, we begin with the 3-tier and 2-tier models. These really are classic, and you might be familiar with them. The classic 3-tier hierarchical model from Cisco was a great early way for us to distinguish the different functions of the network devices from Cisco systems and other vendors that we would be implementing in our network. It begins closest to the end users and is an access layer. And it's aptly named because this is where our end users will be able to access our network resources from. Here at this layer, we find a lot of layer 2 switches, we find wireless access points, and other devices that will get users on the network efficiently. From there, their traffic is passed to a distribution layer. We have a lot of routing going on here, typically a lot of security, quality of service. Oftentimes we call this the policy layer. And from there, the traffic makes it to the core. As we'll see, the core is going to be all about speed and redundancy and real robust products that are going to move traffic as quickly as possible. Now, the 3-tier model can be a bit confusing for students because it has so many other names. I've alluded to it in many different names already in this lesson, like classic and hierarchical. We know that the layers themselves can get different names. A lot of people will refer to the core layer as simply the backbone, and the distribution layer is the aggregation layer. And we know at the access layer, we have our users accessing the network, typically with workstations. So oftentimes you'll hear the access layer referred to as the workstation layer. What goes on at the access layer? Well, lots of stuff. Layer 2 switching is typical, as we alluded to, but we also will find spanning tree protocol, especially in classic models. Now, keep in mind that one of the goals in modern networking is for us to eliminate spanning tree protocol altogether. So while we will be discussing technologies like rapid spanning tree protocol, I really want you to focus in on the fact that spanning tree protocol is something that we strive to eliminate today. There might be lots of power over Ethernet. We are powering IP phones and IP cameras and all kinds of devices like access points that need power, but don't want to be plugged into the traditional power outlets. So we power these devices using power over Ethernet from a power over Ethernet compliant switch. So the switch is not only getting them on the network, this device that needs to be on the network, like an access point, but it's also giving it its power. There's voice over VLAN or voice VLANs, and the voice VLANs allow voice over IP, of course. So when we plug in our Cisco IP phone, for example, it's tucked into a voice VLAN, and this works out great since we can easily prioritize that VLAN and use quality of service against the voice traffic in order to move the voice traffic ahead of other forms of traffic in the queues, and also make sure that it's getting the overall priority that it deserves and needs. There's quality of service functions, certainly here at the access layer, as we just alluded to. And we also like to do a lot of security here at layer 2, like port security, locking down the port by MAC address. And VLAN access control lists can be done here so that we can not only control the ability of a workstation to access some other workstation outside of its VLAN, but with the VLAN access control list, we also have the ability to restrict communications within a VLAN. So our router-based access control lists that we're really used to, those are going to control traffic between VLANs, and the VACL, or VLAN access map, as it's sometimes called, can control traffic within the VLAN. The distribution layer features a lot of security and a lot of routing policy and just routing in general. Load balancing is often done here, and we begin to get into redundancy. Since this layer is so incredibly critical, we want to have redundant gateways, redundant paths, even redundancy inside the Cisco devices, multiple power supplies, multiple line cards, multiple supervisor engines. Lots of redundancy can be added, and in fact, we add as much as we can afford typically. Summarization is done here, so we make routing more efficient by summarizing as much as possible. And then the core layer couldn't be more simple as far as its functionality goes. It's all about speed, speed, and more speed. And redundancy is important here since we want to make sure the core layer is always available to move traffic as quickly as possible through the network. Now, in a smaller enterprise, that level of complexity with our 3 layers oftentimes isn't needed, and we can introduce the first of our 2-tier models. It's the classic 2-tier from our classic 3-tier. We take the core layer and we compress it into the distribution layer. So now overall, note we just have the 2 tiers that are making up the model. There's the access layer, and then there's our core combined with the distribution layer so that we have all of that functionality that I mentioned previously nicely in one layer. This would require, of course, fewer devices, and this would be appropriate for the smaller, less complex enterprise. And this really does simplify things for us when it comes to the overall design. So these models really aren't a thing of the past. In fact, many networks today still organize themselves and recognize these 2 classic models of the 3-tier and the 2-tier hierarchical designs. There's not every enterprise out there that is rushing to adopt the latest Cisco technologies and the latest Cisco designs. So it's great to study these, not only for when we run into these types of networks, but also because it's going to help us understand more sophisticated models that Cisco is now utilizing. In fact, in the very next lesson, we're going to take a look at a 2-tier model that is found in Cisco's software-defined networking solution of the application-centric infrastructure, or ACI. This 2-tier model is very different, very unique from the collapsed core 2-tier that we just took a look at. I hope you'll join me in the next lesson.